The British Army is the principal land warfare force of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The force was initially administered by the War Office from London, which in 1964 was subsumed into the Ministry of Defence. The professional head of the British Army is the Chief of the General Staff. The full-time element of the British Army is referred to as the Regular Army and has been since the creation of the Reservist Territorial Force in 1908. All members of the British Army swear allegiance to the monarch as Commander-in-Chief. However, the Bill of Rights of 1689 requires parliamentary consent for the Crown to maintain a standing army in peacetime. Parliament approves the continued existence of the Army by passing an Armed Forces Act at least once every 5 years, in contrast to the Royal Navy, Royal Marines and Royal Air Force. The British Army does not include Royal in its title because it is not technically a unified organisation, but a collection of regiments and corps, many of which have been granted the Royal prefix and have members of the royal family occupying senior honorary positions within some regiments. Throughout its history, the British Army has seen action in a number of major wars involving the world's great powers, including the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the First World War and Second World War. Repeatedly emerging victorious from these decisive wars allowed Britain to influence world events with its policies and establish itself as one of the world's leading military and economic powers. Since the end of the Cold War, the British Army has been deployed to many conflict zones, often as part of an expeditionary force or a United Nations peacekeeping operation. Additionally, the British Army maintains several permanent overseas postings. History. The English Army was first established as a standing military force in 1660. In 1707 many regiments of the English and Scottish armies were already combined under one operational command and stationed in the Netherlands, fighting in the War of Spanish Succession. Consequently, although the regiments were now part of the new British military establishment, they remained under the same operational command, and so not only were the regiments of the old armies transferred in situ to the new army, so too was the institutional ethos, customs, and traditions of the old standing armies that had been created shortly after the restoration of the monarchy 66 years earlier. The order of seniority of the most senior line regiments in the British Army is based on the order of seniority in the English Army. Scottish and Irish regiments were only allowed to take a rank in the English Army from the date of their arrival in England or the date when they were first placed on the English establishment. For example, in 1694 a board of general officers was convened to decide the rank of English, Irish and Scots regiments serving in the Netherlands. The regiment that became known as the Scots Greys were designated as the 4th Dragoons because there were 3 English regiments raised prior to 1688 when the Scots Greys were first placed on the English establishment. In 1713, when a new Board of General Officers was convened to decide upon the rank of several regiments, the seniority of the Scots Greys was reassessed and based on their entry into England in June 1685. At that time there was only one English regiment of dragoons, and so after some delay the Scots Greys obtained the rank of 2nd Dragoons in the British Army. Following William and Mary's accession to the throne, England involved itself in the War of the Grand Alliance, primarily to prevent a French invasion, restoring Mary's father, James II. Following the union of England and Scotland in 1707, and the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801, British foreign policy on the continent was to contain expansion by its competitor powers such as France and Spain. Spain, in the previous 2 centuries, had been the dominant global power, and the chief threat to England's early transatlantic ambitions, but was now waning. The territorial ambitions of the French, however, led to the War of the Spanish Succession and the Napoleonic Wars. Russian activity led to the Crimean War. After 1745, recruits were increasingly drawn from Scotland. By the mid-1760s, between 1/5 and 1/3 of officers were from Scotland. From the time of the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Great Britain, and its successor, the United Kingdom, was one of the leading military and economic powers of the world. Early British Empire. The British Empire expanded in this time to include colonies, protectorates, and dominions throughout the Americas, Africa, Asia and Australasia. Although the Royal Navy is widely regarded as having been vital for the rise of the British Empire, and British dominance of the world, the British Army played an important role in the colonization of India and other regions. Typical tasks included garrisoning the colonies, capturing strategically important territories, and participating in actions to pacify colonial borders, provide support to Allied governments, suppress Britain's rivals, and protect against foreign powers and hostile natives. British soldiers also helped capture strategically important territories, allowing the empire to expand. The army was also involved in numerous wars to pacify the borders, or to prop up friendly governments, and thereby keep other, competitive, empires away from the British Empire's borders. Among these actions were the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, the First and Second Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, the New Zealand Wars, the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, the First and Second Boer Wars, the Fenian Raids, the Irish War of Independence, its serial interventions into Afghanistan, and the Crimean War. As had its predecessor, the English Army, the British Army fought Spain, France, and the Netherlands for supremacy in North America and the West Indies, with native and provincial assistance. The army conquered New France in the North American theater of the 7 Years' War and subsequently suppressed a Native American uprising in Pontiac's War. The British Army suffered defeat in the American War of Independence, losing the 13 colonies but holding on to Canada. The British Army was heavily involved in the Napoleonic Wars and served in multiple campaigns across Europe, the Caribbean, North Africa and later in North America. The war between the British and the First French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte stretched around the world and at its peak, in 1813. The regular army contained over 250,000 men. A coalition of Anglo-Dutch and Prussian armies under the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal von Blücher defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. In 1815, the English had been involved, both politically and militarily, in Ireland since being given the lordship of Ireland by the Pope in 1171. The campaign of the English Republican protector, Oliver Cromwell, involved uncompromising treatment of the Irish towns that had supported the Royalists during the English Civil War. The English army stayed in Ireland primarily to suppress numerous Irish revolts and campaigns for independence. In addition to its ongoing conflict with ethnic Irish nationalists, it was faced with the prospect of battling Anglo-Irish and Ulster Scots peoples in Ireland, angered primarily by unfavourable taxation of Irish produce imported into Britain, who, alongside other Irish groups, had raised their own volunteer army and threatened to emulate the American colonists if their conditions were not met. Having learnt from their experience in America, the British government sought a political solution. The British Army found itself fighting Irish rebels, both Protestant and Catholic, primarily in Ulster and Leinster in the 1798 rebellion, in addition to battling the armies of other European empires, in the battle for global supremacy. The British Army fought the Chinese in the First and Second Opium Wars, and the Boxer Rebellion, Maori tribes in the first of the New Zealand Wars. Nawab Siraj ud Daulat's forces and British East India Company mutineers in the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, the Boers in the First and Second Boer Wars, Irish Fenians in Canada during the Fenian Raids and Irish separatists in the Anglo-Irish War. The vastly increasing demands of imperial expansion, and the inadequacies and inefficiencies of the underfunded, post-Napoleonic Wars British Army, and of the militia, yeomanry, and volunteer force, led to the Cardwell and Childers reforms of the late 19th century, which gave the British Army its modern shape, and redefined its regimental system. The Haldane reforms of 1907 formally created the Territorial Force as the Army's volunteer reserve component by merging and reorganizing the volunteer force, militia, and yeomanry. World Wars. Great Britain's dominance of the world had been challenged by numerous other powers in the 20th century, most notably Germany. A century before, it was still vying with Napoleonic France for pre-eminence in Europe and around the world, and Hanoverian Britain's natural allies were the various kingdoms and principalities of northern Germany. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain and France were allied in preventing Russia's appropriation of the Ottoman Empire. By the first decade of the 20th century, however, the United Kingdom was allied with France in Russia, and when the First World War broke out in 1914, the British Army sent the British Expeditionary Force to France and Belgium to prevent Germany from occupying these countries. The British Army created the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force in Egypt and sent it to Gallipoli in an unsuccessful attempt to capture Constantinople, and secure a sea route to Russia. After the retreat from Gallipoli, nearly 400,000 men in 13 divisions from the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force and the force in Egypt formed a strategic reserve in Egypt, called the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, with most of the strategic reserve sent to the Western Front. An Egyptian expeditionary force of 2 British infantry and 1 Australian and New Zealand mounted division in the Eastern Force successfully defend the Suez Canal and Romani in 1916 from German and Ottoman incursions. This force captured the Sinai and garrisoned the extended lines of communication. But in early 1917 their advance was stopped at Gaza until towards the end of the year, when a greatly enlarged force of infantry and mounted troops captured Beersheba, most of southern Palestine and Jerusalem. Allenby's force, now including Indian Army units which replaced a number of British units sent to the Western Front, captured the southern Jordan Valley in 1918 and carried out 2 major but unsuccessful attacks to Amman and Es-Salt and occupied part of the Jordan Valley. During preparations for his final successful assault in September at the Battle of Megiddo, as a result of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force's capture of 2 Ottoman armies, an armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed on 31 October 1918. The First World War was the most devastating in British military history, with nearly 800,000 men killed and over 2 million wounded. In the early part of the war, the professional force of the BEF was virtually destroyed and, by turns, a volunteer force replaced it. Major battles included the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Passchendaele. Advances in technology saw advent of the tank, with the creation of the Royal Tank Regiment, and advances in aircraft design, with the creation of the Royal Flying Corps, which were to be decisive in future battles. Trench warfare dominated strategy on the Western Front, and the use of chemical and poison gases added to the devastation. The Second World War broke out in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. British assurances to the Polish led the British Empire to declare war on Germany. Again an expeditionary force was sent to France, only to be hastily evacuated as the German forces swept through the Low Countries and across France in May 1940. Only the Dunkirk evacuation saved the entire BEF from capture. Later, however, the British would have spectacular success defeating the Italians and Germans at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa from 1940 to 1943. Italy, and in the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944 with the help of American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Indian and Free French forces. Almost half of the Allied soldiers on D-Day were British. In the Far East, the British Army battled the Japanese in the Burma Campaign. The Second World War saw the British Army develop its Special Air Service, Commando units and the Parachute Regiment. Post-colonial era. After the end of the Second World War, the British Army was significantly reduced in size, although national service continued until 1960. This period also saw the process of decolonization commence with the partition and independence of India and Pakistan, followed by the independence of British colonies in Africa and Asia. Accordingly, the Army's strength was further reduced, in recognition of Britain's reduced role in world affairs, outlined in the 1957 Defense White Paper. This was despite major actions in Korea in the early 1950s and Suez in 1956. A large force of British troops also remained in Germany, facing the threat of Soviet invasion. The British Army of the Rhine was the Germany garrison formation, with the main fighting force being 1st Corps. The Cold War saw significant technological advances in warfare, and the Army saw more technologically advanced weapons systems come into service. Despite the decline of the British Empire, the Army was still deployed around the world, fighting wars in Aden, Indonesia, Cyprus, Kenya and Malaya. In 1982, the British Army, alongside the Royal Marines, helped to recapture the Falkland Islands during the Falklands conflict against Argentina. In the 3 decades following 1969, the Army was heavily deployed in Northern Ireland to support the Royal Ulster Constabulary in their conflict with Republican paramilitary groups, called Operation Banner. The locally recruited Ulster Defence Regiment was formed, later becoming Home Service battalions in the Royal Irish Regiment in 1992, before being disbanded in 2006. Over 700 soldiers were killed during the Troubles. Following the IRA ceasefires between 1994 and 1996 and since 1997, demilitarization has taken place as part of the peace process, reducing the military presence from 30,000 to 5,000 troops. On 25 June 2007, the 2nd Battalion Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment vacated the Army complex at Besbrook Mill in Armagh. This is part of the normalisation programme in Northern Ireland in response to the IRA's declared end to its activities.